you look at the list of prior symposium workshops and count, you'll notice this is the 20th year of the Haskell workshop or symposium. So I think that's a real testament to the community. There's one more year I'd like to call out here on this list, and that's 2007 in Freiburg. So of course that was the final year of the Haskell workshop. The following year in Victoria, we had been upgraded to the Haskell symposium. It also turns out that that was the first year that I attended ICFP or the Haskell workshop. So at the time, I was a poor graduate student, feeling increasingly isolated and alone because I was not only the sole pure functional programmer, but the sole functional programmer in a fairly hardcore systems research group. So obviously I found a new home outside of systems here in the PL community. And it was a great honor to be asked to serve as PC chair this year. So I've noticed on a personal level that the functional languages community, and in particular the Haskell community, has been very welcoming, very warm, been a very safe space to discuss ideas and be a researcher. And I hope that we all endeavor, I think we've all had similar experiences, and I hope that we all endeavor to maintain that sense of community, ensure that the community is as welcoming to future members as it has been to us. So thank you. So this was the second year that we continued the two-phase review process with an early round and a main round. So this year we only had 3 early submissions. It turned out that 1 was accepted immediately, 1 was rejected, and 1 was resubmitted to the primary round. We had 27 additional submissions. Our resubmission for the early round was accepted. And then we accepted 16 additional papers and rejected 11. So our submission rate was a little bit lower than usual, but it's primarily in line with the historical submission rates. However, our attendance, and I only had the numbers from the previous 2 years, was a little bit better than it was last year. So we're doing quite well. Just a few words about the review process itself. So we had an electronic PC meeting using hot CRP. Each paper received at least, sorry, this is the day 1 and day 2 attendance numbers. So they count them differently. So that's what the 2 numbers are. Yeah. So each paper received at least 3 PC reviews. We had some trouble acquiring experience reports last year. So I'm pleased to say that we had 2 this year, including 1 early submission. And despite having only 3 early submissions, I think the early round really did serve its purpose. So 1 paper was accepted early, which was great. And a second paper received a substantial amount of feedback from the PC. I think the authors found that useful. And when it was resubmitted, it was substantially revised and it made it in. So that was really a successful use of the early review process. I will point out that submitting early only increases your chances of having a paper accepted. So I hope next year we see more early submissions. So thanks to the program committee, we had a compressed reviewing schedule this year, so I certainly appreciate all their efforts. And also thanks to the steering committee. So every year we rotate out from the steering committee the most senior member at large and the most senior prior PC chair. So thanks to Jin Jiang and Ken for their service. And I'm pleased to announce that Duncan is the new member at large. So there's one more person I'd like to call out for special thanks. And that's Yabor. So of course he was on the PC this year, which I certainly appreciated. And many of you probably know that he's also helped run the ICFP programming contest, not once but twice. Of course it took more than a decade for him to recover from the first time, but nonetheless. And he's also skillfully managed the video recordings for ICFP and affiliated events. So Yabor has done many good deeds, and because we cannot allow any good deed to go unpunished, I'm also pleased to announce that he will be next year's PC chair. So thank you, Yabor. So keeping with tradition, I'm going to turn the floor over to Yabor, and he will handle the Future of Haskell session. So just one note, as we have people asking questions, if you could line up queue up at the front of the room, that'll make it easier to manage. Oop.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, good. Okay, so for the state of Haskell discussion, what I was thinking of doing, if it is okay with everybody, is to kind of do a slightly self-serving discussion. So I also happen to be on the Haskell Prime committee, and as many of you may have noticed, Haskell Prime has been a little bit stuck. So we have the committee, but nothing's really happened very much. And so in an effort to kind of get the process going, we had a meeting with the committee members who were here the other day, and it was very productive, and we kind of discussed what sorts of language features might we try to standardize. Why are we doing that? Well, I do a lot of Haskell programming, both for fun and for work, and in my experience, the state of Haskell is kind of like this, okay? And so this is a literate Haskell talk. So, okay, so I had a lot of language extensions because I was trying to give examples of some of them, but really quite a lot of our files are like that. And that's not great. Why is that? Okay, well, it's a lot of stuff to type, but that's not the worst thing. These are not all equal kind of difficulty extensions. Some of them are kind of small syntactic extensions, and some of them are kind of measure extensions. So when you look at them, it's really not very easy to kind of tell, is this file really using kind of conservative normal Haskell, or is it using some kind of crazy extensions that might break with, you know, the next version of the compiler and so on. So I thought maybe the topic for this discussion could be a discussion with the part of the community that's here, where we can go over to a whole lot of extensions and see what do people want standardized? What would you really like to get into the next version of the language, or perhaps out of the current version of the language? If it's always trickier to get things out, but maybe there are things. So on these slides, I have a whole lot of things I thought about, and I will show you a couple of the slides to get the discussion started. But please do comment on what you think and come and suggest other things. And I have my notebook here, and I'll take notes. And yeah, so maybe we can get a sense of at least this part of the community, where do you guys want the language to go next? Okay, so the first language extension I will start with is what we picked on Monday, a very sophisticated extension to kind of get the process going. It is tuple sections. Okay, so to get the process started, we thought, okay, let's pick the smallest possible thing we can think of and try to get it through the whole process of the report. I don't know, do people have any feelings about it? So tuple sections are tiny syntactic extensions that allow you to create tuples, kind of, well, functions that create tuples. Yes, please. Okay, yay, we have one feature in. Excellent. Okay, tuple sections, check. All right. Okay, next, this one I think might be more controversial. Okay, so on the record in tuples, these are some extensions that I actually use a lot in my code because I think that they are quite neat. It is record punning and record wildcards. Okay, and so record punning used to be in the language, and then it went away, and then I think maybe we should get it back in. So I saw some comments there. So could you stand up and, or well, Kenny's right there. So.
So are both useful, but the wildcards introduce names that might change. So that's always a bit might break your code. So I wouldn't want to see wildcards as a standard, but punning might be the standard. Also, I'm not sure, maybe somebody else knows what might go wrong with wildcards. But punning seems much easier than the wildcards. Even so, of course, you can go away with like you don't have to use the wildcards if you don't want to. But I'd see rather punning as a standard than wildcards.
Yeah, that is a very good point.
I just want to be. I sort of want to divide these ideas into two pieces. One is, do we want to standardize this as something that, you know, we want to say, yes, this is a standard extension, but I still think it could be okay to have it as an extension, something where you have to opt into it, because, you know, maybe I want that to be an error saying I forgot to bind my variables, and if we make it built in by default, then that's no longer an error. So I think we can divide these things in two. So this isn't specifically about this extension, but as we're thinking about these extensions, I think it's okay to say gee, this is a great idea, a lot of people want this, but I want to be able to also opt out or opt in, something like that.
Right. I didn't mention, well, so there's a few reasons why we might get things into the standard. And the one is certainly to, well, make the files shorter. As I said, just say I'm using Haskell and then you know what that means. But of course, the other one is that we're in the kind of unfortunate situation currently that none of our Haskell books, I think, are actually what people program. So you go read a Haskell book and then you type it in, it doesn't work, right? So as usual, standards are great so that you have a baseline. Maybe you want to implement a new compiler. You know, well, it'd be nice to know what to implement, sort of, right? So, but as Richard says, we are certainly, just because things are not standardized doesn't mean they'll go away from GHC, I imagine. And John has a comment.
So I always hesitate to raise a syntax because one could take years on syntax. But in the early days of Haskell, there was a really very simple principle that functions bound most tightly and then everything else less tightly. And so, but if you look at, for example, pun example, you've got this challenge that it looks at first like pun example has two separate arguments in some sense. And so the question is, can we, as we do extensions, can we make sure that there are some really clear principles that the syntax follows and that those principles are uniformly applied, as opposed to, well, this is a special case and, you know, it would be nice not to have to write parentheses, you know, because we all know what it means, but actually, you know, it just adds potentially unnecessary complexity.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point.
Yeah, I agree with you about that, John. But I think this is an existing thing. This is nothing to do with punning. This is the way Haskell is today. I think I rather wish we'd insisted on parentheses here, and I personally always put them in.
Oh, that's something we could still change, presumably.
Maybe we could take it out. Yes.
Yeah.
Yay.
Separate.
So, sorry, I want to go back to tuple sections for a bit. So, one thing I'm unclear of is, are we proposing that we take the current implementation of tuple sections and just make that the default? The reason I ask is because I understand how tuple sections work on expressions. One thing I'm not as clear on is, are you also allowed to have tuple sections at the type and pattern level? Is that being proposed, or are we just going with what is currently in GHC?
Okay, so that's a good point. Usually when I refer to the extensions, I'm referring to the way things are in GHC simply because this is the thing you know, we have experience with, but that's not what necessarily we need to standardize. So what I had in mind here was certainly just the like normal sections only use them at the value level, but it is an interesting idea to have a look at maybe a notation for sections at the type level too. So that I just hadn't occurred to me to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. And, Leonard.
Well, so it makes no sense as patterns, and it makes very little sense on the type level, since it's only the last one you could leave out.
Yeah.
So, no.
Right.
But in any case, the point, Yavo, is, isn't it, that you're not saying, should it be exactly as it is in GHC? You're saying, if this is something that we might want to try, then right. You know, that somebody would write up a detailed proposal that says, here's an exact proposal, you'd get it debated, right?
Yeah.
And it would end up in the report.
That's right.
And so there's plenty of, it's definitely not just shrink wrap what GHC currently does.
No, in fact, yeah, I should have mentioned that I would please like everybody to try and join in on the discussion and kind of mail to the Haskell Prime mailing list what are things you would like standardized, kind of, right? So the process we are currently going to have is where a proposal is going to be first written up, and then the committee is going to have a discussion about is it clear enough, is it a good idea, whatnot. Then once we've decided it's a good idea, then somebody is going to actually put it in the Haskell report, and we're going to review the changes to that, and then it's going to be officially approved extension. So that's the plan. So, you know, there will be plenty of opportunity for discussion of the details. Okay, Joachim, please.
Yeah, sorry for making the discussion a bit multi-threaded, but I want to come back to what Richard said about making things options. I think the value of a standardization is to not have options anymore, but rather agree on one thing that most of us are happy with and the rest can live with, in order to not make this choice every time. Do I want to enable this extension or not? So I think, especially things like syntax, where you opt in by using it, I'd rather not see that anymore as a language extension that unless you maybe in special cases disable it, that you have to think about it as an extension to the language, but rather as a language feature that is now in the language. So it's easier to keep things optional, and it's always tempting to make an option for the user to do this or do this, but that's the easy way out, and the hard way out is thinking with a solution, coming with a solution that works for everyone, and we should try to do that here.
Yeah, I would hope that on most things we can agree that they're a good idea, and just accept them rather than saying, okay, no, that's a feature. But well, okay, I don't see any comments on that, so we can maybe go to another thing. There's
I still have a bit of a rebuttal. I wouldn't want to have. I think the problem with putting something right in there, because like with the pun example thing with the bracketing, right? The danger of making that actually part of the language is that if everyone starts using the wrong thing, then everyone has to live with the wrong thing forever.
Oh, that's right. Certainly, we don't want to put the wrong things in the standard, hopefully. So, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, what do I have next? Okay, so next, another very commonly and perhaps not terribly controversial feature is, the features about controlling evaluation, so bang patterns, basically. And so the thing about bang patterns is that they're kind of, one GHC extension enables two related features. So I've given a little example there. The one is the ability to add a exclamation point on a parameter, meaning that essentially as soon as the function calls it, it should first seek the argument. So the function is strict in this argument, and the programmer can make that explicit. So it avoids some seeks. And the other one is this where clause there, which also looks like a bang pattern, but it's in fact a little bit different in that it is an actual strict declaration. And so, for example, currently in GHC, you can't have this strict declaration at the top level of a program because it's not very clear when they should be evaluated, maybe when the program starts or something. So this was the first part. So I don't know how people feel about bang patterns. We already saw a talk that was clearly using them. So I've used them on occasion, and they seem quite useful when you try to tune things in. Does anybody have any comments? Yes, please. Yes, please. Excellent.
From my experience, there are a couple of weird places where I cannot put bang patterns. For example, I can't put it in front of main, which makes sense, and then or any top-level declarations, or some recursive bindings. And then there are also problems occurring when I put two bang patterns in from one pattern, which is allowed by the syntax, but it is currently a bug. So I think before we allow bang patterns by default, it might be good to clean this up and to see where are the places that make sense to allow.
That's a very good point. Yeah, in fact, I think we should only have them on variables.
A bug? Surely not. Please submit a bug report.
Yeah, there's also some kind of funny business with bang patterns on how it associates with infix operator patterns, and this is something that I think should also be cleaned up, because if you put a bang x colon x's, for instance, this is something that's allowed, but it doesn't actually do what you might expect it to do if there's a
or no.
So it forces the console to, I believe, that's it doesn't actually force the head of the list.
They should have very high priority too.
So that's I believe that is from memory, but
okay. So these are all things that hopefully, as we start writing the grammar and all that, we can work out the details exactly. Richard?
Sorry to cycle back a sec. On the record puns, we got past that. There's a great opportunity here. There's a lot of people. How many people would want that in the language? Yes, please. How many people would not want that in the language? Interesting. I mean, this is one thing as someone who's thinking about adding features, it's so hard on the internet to get a sense of what people want and don't want. And so I wanted to sort of, even if we don't have debate, just to get an idea of where the winds are blowing.
Richard, are you asking specifically about puns or wildcards too?
I was asking about puns, but okay, that's right. Okay, so clearly there's three options here. So many people maybe don't care, right? And that's fine. So would you want puns in the language?
Okay, that's
Would
quite a lot
you
of people.
not want puns in the language?
There are some people as
Okay,
well.
that's a little clearer. Wildcards. Would you want wildcards in the language? Ah.
Oh,
Yeah,
I
we don't
didn't have an example. So a wildcard, let me go back, is, I should have written an example. So you see where it is point x comma y? You can instead write point dot dot. And that means it abbreviates to please add all the fields of the record. So the drawback that people don't like, it's a little bit like an import where you're not saying explicitly what you're importing. So you're always importing whatever the fields of the declaration are, but you know the data declaration may be in a different module or something like that, and that's why people don't like them sometimes. On the other hand, and by the way, I should mention these are not just patterns, but you can use them as expressions as well to create values. So you can write point x, y, and that will create a record that would say point x equals x and y equals y. And similarly with the wildcards, you can say point dot dot, and it means please create a record where the fields are initialized by the variables with the same names, essentially. And that's really very useful, especially in combinations with applicative do. If you're making some big structure where you're saying, okay, get this from the network, get that from the network, get that from the network, and please put them all in a record now. So you can certainly do it, but you end up saying things like where point x equals x and y equals y and this equals this, and it's a lot of repetition. So it's purely syntactic sugar, but yeah, sometimes people don't like it because you have these names that don't appear to be bound anywhere. Really, they're bound by the dot dot operator.
Can they be partial? Dot dot, it actually you're bringing into scope variables with all the field names that exist.
Correct.
Yes. Well, all the ones.
Me too.
Yeah.
In my defense, this was Leonard who made this happen.
Please use the microphone so we have a record of all that. Now, all right.
Okay.
Jenny?
Yeah. I have a question about how the punning works. So you've got point x, y in there, right? What if I just wanted x? Do I still have to say x comma y?
No, you can just say x.
Okay.
So, and similarly, they mix nicely punning and record. So you can say x comma dot dot or something like that. Well, or rather, x equals something dot dot. And so the dot dot doesn't always recur to all the things. It refers only to the things you didn't match, kind of, explicitly. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a pretty neat feature, but.
As the person who suggested the dot dot extension, I mean, I'm as horrified by it as you are. But for some practical things where you have records with lots and lots of fields, it's incredibly convenient. Yeah. So it's a balance between being horrible and having convenience. So
That's right. So language design does sometimes require a little bit of compromise.
Yeah. So I would like to say, you know, don't have it. People should opt in with wildcards. Yeah. But even if it's in the library, it should be opt in. But also, can we not have it be just a warning? Can it be an error if you create using record wildcards, but you don't have all of the variables declared?
Sure. I mean, I kind of think that should be an error with all records.
It's currently a warning, yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so that's a good idea to have a whole separate thing whenever you forget to initialize a field to make this an error. I think that.
Yes, I definitely agree with. I also agree with Leonard when you're working with large records, and I personally use that quite a lot. So I was actually quite surprised by the number of people who are objecting to this. I mean, it seems to me like this is something that if you don't want it, you just don't use the syntax, and it doesn't cause you any problems. It does?
Well, notice I haven't even gotten to the type system. We're just talking.
So my rebuttal is I've used record wildcards in the same way. When you know what's going on, it's incredibly convenient. It saves you a whole lot of boilerplate. I would like a solution that allows us to do something about that necessary boilerplate. And the x equals x stuff is ridiculous. But the worst part is that every time I've looked at a piece of code that someone else has written, and first of all, it took me a long time to learn how to parse curly brace, dot, dot, curly brace. But even after that, I'm like, wow, what's all the symbols that have come in? And I'm just sort of vaguely aware that these look like functions, but suddenly they're variables. And it's the duality between the fact that ordinarily they're functions, and then sometimes they're variables, and sometimes they aren't again, which I find very, very challenging from a maintainability reading standpoint. Yes, it's something I probably should just learn, but it really, this is why I don't like it being optional. Either wang it into the language and force us all to deal with it, or make it go away.
The IDE will tell you where variables come from.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. Who's next?
Was that the problem you were?
That's my objection to it. It's incredibly convenient. It's insanely convenient. Saves all kinds of trouble, but I can never I figure out what's going on. And
in your own code, you can choose.
even in my own code, like remember when you're writing code, write code to the 6 months you who didn't write it, right? This is like all the stuff about comments and stuff. 6 months from now, you aren't the person that wrote that code. It doesn't matter how clever you were when you were writing it. Can you read it? It becomes someone else's code. So you need to actually pull back from the brink a little bit. At least in any kind of a setting where you are, if you're writing it once and then sending it off to fly and never looking at it again, great. And one of the brilliant things about Haskell and my enthusiasm for it is that code keeps working. But if you're trying to maintain something over time, or you're working between multiple projects, and that magic 6 month mark comes to pass between when you worked on it and the next time you see it, suddenly you don't remember what's going on there. So anything that makes it harder to comprehend code is something that I advocate against, only for that reason.
Okay.
I just wanted to add what Andrew stole my comments, but in our internal language guidelines for Haskell, this is one of the few extensions that we explicitly disallow for those sorts of reasons. So it's not allowed at all in the Ambiata code base.
Okay.
Because we've had these maintainability issues.
So you guys find that you change your data types more than you change your functions?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So not as an argument. Oh.
No.
So not as an argument, particularly pro or con, but an issue that hasn't been brought up yet is that both of these extensions are basically introducing name shadowing, and so that's a big concern that people have with it.
Okay.
So one thing I just wanted to bring up in terms of so I'm also on the Language Prime committee, in terms of basically anything dealing with records, whether it's these two extensions or anything else, is there are a whole lot of alternative record proposals out there, because kind of everybody hates records, but they hate them in slightly different ways and want slightly different things out of them.
I don't.
Except for Yawar. So my kind of concern in terms of my role on the language committee is sort of committing to, yes, this is, the way that we currently do records plus whatever extensions is sort of what we really want, versus all the menagerie of other things out there. So I kind of feel like it's a larger discussion than we could have here, but it's sort of something to bear in mind with regards to records as opposed to the various other, the tuple sections or type level things or various other stuff. Is records are like an extremely hot topic. So
fair enough. Yep.
As someone who has been looking at scheme macro systems, and in particular hygiene in those systems, I'm looking at this and seeing that if you allow a ... syntax, that's actually going to cause trouble with being able to track, with the macro system being able to track which identifiers come from which places. So I think there could be some issues down the road if, for example, I want to add it, a macro system that supports full hygiene. And
that's fair enough, but I know we can talk afterwards, but it's not like you don't know what it's bound. It's just the declaration is a little bit further away. You still know exactly what's in scope, right? So any system that knows about the language should know about that.
The issue is that in a macro system, you can run into situations where you could have multiple X's that were introduced by different invocations of some macro. So you need to be able to keep those separate, which means that when those variables are introduced, the X and the X comma and the Y comma to the left of the equals is doing that. We need that information to be able to tell us which X are we talking about.
Okay, but you could completely desugar that away, right? It's not like, yeah. But anyway, we can take that offline. Maybe lunch is coming up also, I should point out, so the discussion can continue over lunch. Thank you.
I'd just like to point out that there's a difference in using the wildcard as a pattern where you're bringing new names into scope versus as an expression where you're constructing a record based on the things that are already in scope. And I could live without the wildcard as a pattern, but not without it as an expression. I find that's infinitely more, not infinitely, but much more useful.
Okay, that's a good point. I use it a lot to construct values as well. So that's another option to consider, slicing it halfway to. Okay, Richard?
Several people have talked about convenience. It might also be convenient to have a list containing 3 and true. We don't do that.
That's very inconvenient, Richard.
And the other thing is, I like to think about optimizing reading over writing. Code gets written a few times, but I think gets read a whole lot more.
Okay.
I agree with both of those. So I'm going to say a wee word about wildcards, but then I want to up level a bit. About wildcards, it's clear that there's a lot of contention about that. You should probably be going for something that's more standard, right? We already have a mechanism for insane but useful things, which is Simon just hacks them into GHC. That's not what Haskell Prime should be about.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Haskell Prime should be focusing, as you said, on trying to consolidate things.
Yep.
And as you've seen from talking to this group, right, trying to consolidate things by discussion among a very large number of people is going to be tough. Consolidation requires a lot of taste. So the way I would like to see Haskell Prime go forward is for a tiny number of people, maybe just one, to really take it on themselves to say, can I pull together a tasteful collection of things that we could standardize on and would give people a standard way of writing these things that everybody could read. As several people pointed out, readability is extremely important, and that's why we want to have a standard things that are not options, right? But to build our vernacular about what we agree is standard. I think that's a great idea. It's very hard, and I think the right way to do it is to have a tiny number of people backed up by the rest of the community so that they can put out a proposal and then people can discuss it. When there's a lot of pushback, like on wildcards, you could go, well, maybe I don't want to do that. And then other things like punning, it looks like lots of people go, yeah, okay, that works fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to get the feel for the community for exactly these kinds of
But for Prime to work, I think it really has to have a purpose and then a few real driving personalities. So I guess what I want to do is, right, Hamming says the way you get things done in research is through courage. You know, being willing to just take on stuff that people thought, oh, can you do that? Yes, you can. Right. So I wanted to encourage courage among those people leading Haskell Prime. Just a few people should step forward, and then everybody else should back them up. Right. That's the where we get things done. A few more words actually on what's going on with Haskell Prime, what you see happening, and so on. That would be very welcome, I think.
What I see happening next, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
or
I
even
think
what's happening now, because some of us aren't informed on this as we should be.
Nothing. Very little has actually happened. So I think that what's happened is that we have reformed the Haskell Prime committee, as far as I know. So we now have a committee, and I actually have not met all the members on the committee. I was hoping to meet more of them here, but I met some new ones that I hadn't seen. And so now that we have a committee, we've been trying to actually do something. So yeah, I started kind of collecting feedback from the community about what might be good thing, because I mean I have my opinions about, as you see, what might be good to do, what might not be, but you know, as you say, you want the community to back us. And so the committee, I think, is at the moment about 20 people, correct me if I'm wrong, so it's a pretty large committee. But we were trying to be inclusive and kind of representative, well, get representatives from all parts of the community, so that's why the committee is bigger. I should say Herbert is the committee chair, I believe, but he couldn't make it here. So I'm just a member who's kind of trying to get things going, basically, is my interest in this thing, because I feel we have been a little bit stuck, in part because anything you suggest, there's always somebody who feels, well, that's not quite right. So I really appreciate your advice that, well, at the end of the day, we have to do something, and hopefully the community will back us.
You don't have to do things, right? We could just leave things as they are now. Right. But if you're going to do something, do it, right? Yeah. Get stuck in there, and having a few people driving it, I think would work well. Can I ask about something a bit larger? What's the status of GADTs? They're not in Haskell 98, right? Because they're more recent than that.
They're just a GHC extension, so it's one of my things further late. Well, we've only done 2 of the slides. No, not surprisingly, I wrote a lot in case they were going very quick. But GADTs are not in Haskell Prime. I know that some of the Haskell Prime members are really interested in standardizing them. GADTs are much more, it seems that there's a whole lot of simpler features to standardize.
No. The simplest thing to do is a significant change to the semantics. People will not argue over that the way they do over syntax.
That's right. That's a fair point. But
and it might gain and it might gain you a bit more as well, right? The work will give you more bang for the buck, as it were.
Yeah.
The last thing I was going to suggest is it's great that you're reformulating the Prime Committee and that you're going to try to get some work done. As I say, pick a person and then everybody else put power to their elbow. But also maybe just to get started, meet in person once. This is, it helped a lot with the Haskell Committee. We met in person lots of times, and then we found we could do it all online, and that was better.
Mm-hmm. That's a good idea.
But meeting in person a couple of times, I think, really helps.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good idea. Maybe I'll try to organize something.
Just really quick, because we're short on time. I just want to say, could the Haskell Prime Committee members raise their hands so other people can find us during lunch? So if you want to complain and/or give us feedback. I don't want to comment on any of this because we could
Nick
spend all
Wu
day.
is around.
Yeah, and,
well, I don't know if he's still around, but he was
but
earlier at the conference.
So yeah, just come find us if you want to say anything.
Okay. "12 minutes, okay, good. Okay, well, apparently we have a little bit more time. So, semantics of strict data types, that's a small detail, let's skip over that. But it's something I didn't know it was like that until I tried it out. So, as an exercise for the reader, what does seek example there return? Would be the exercise. But anyway, that might be something. Oh, we have an answer?
Well, since a bunch of us kind of discussed a lot of these over the table, I actually wanted to follow up with Phil's question and sort of force an issue that's been contention, which is, what do we want to do with GADTs? So everybody likes them, but there's a lot of difficulty in implementing them, and I know a lot of people here have sort of alternative compilers for Haskell or are interested in things like that. And I mean, saying, oh, you have to do GADTs in order to do Haskell is a very high bar. Is that something we want to do?
A couple of volunteers to do it there.
I think it raises the bar very significantly over everything else.
Okay, that's a good point.
So my take on the GADTs issue is it's not as much as a high bar for implementation, but a high bar for specification. I'm as yet unaware of a specification for GADTs or the one that GHC implements that actually describes when you write a program whether or not that program will be accepted.
Yeah, I'm not sure if people also know what's the status of this. How do you give semantics to these things in like a denotational model or something like that? Yeah.
Good.
So how about some overloading? Okay, so another extension that I use a lot is overloaded strings. But funnily enough, when I look at how I use overloaded strings, I use them in exactly one way. It is to create strings of type text. So I don't know, do we want to have the whole extension in the language just for that pattern, or do people use it for other things too? Or maybe should we change text to be the default representations instead of strings, which would break everything, so probably we shouldn't do that. I don't know if people have comments on that. We should use backpack instead.
So I'm going to hijack this for a bit. I know we're tight on time, but first of all, I'd say just leave it alone. It already works. It has a semantic. You implement isString, carry on. I don't think you need to make a call about it being specialized to text. But I want to jump further than that. about this point, everybody starts thinking about an alternate prelude that has things like show of type A to text, because text is better, right? And the problem, and so we have a bunch of different preludes around it. So when I hear about the Haskell Prime efforts, it took me a while to realize you weren't talking about smoothing some of the warts off of the language that have accumulated over the 35 years you guys have been doing this. 55 years. How old are you? Oh, very good. And because I think that talking about language extensions is part of the puzzle, but the experience of anybody working in the language includes the prelude and then fighting the prelude and then all the other things you have to bring in. I've been having a lovely argument with Neil Mitchell the last couple of weeks over Twitter saying, because he got really excited about the new edition of Graham's book, and I asked a question about was there a chapter about op parse applicative in there, because I always had trouble with that. And he's like, oh, no, it's just the basics. And I'm like, where is text and byte string and all the the things you need in order to write programs? And so this has been an ongoing debate, but I want to commend to everybody the work of Vincent Henriquez recently. He's got a post up. You've probably seen it if you're plugged into social this or that. And when he came up with Foundation, I was like, oh, come on, Vincent, not another prelude. Like, just get with Stefan Dell's protolude or what Ambiata's up to. And incidentally, I've encouraged Ambiata to publish theirs in an annotated form so we can have a number. Anybody that's got a custom prelude, I want you to get it out there in LHS form with documentation about why you made the choices you did. Not to argue about the choices, so we can see 3 or 4 examples of how people are fighting against the prelude that we've inherited in terms of what makes essentially the experience of modern Haskell, which as then could be a potentially useful input into the next version of the language committee. But then I saw Vincent's work, and I was like, oh, here, another prelude. But he wasn't attacking that. He wasn't saying, oh, well, we've just got to make it easier to use byte string and text. He attacked the array allocation problem, which was underneath byte string and text and vector is the need to have boxed and unboxed vectors, and if you start there and make it so that essentially all those types share a vector type underneath, you've basically got interoperability across all the actual allocated stuff, which was kind of frankly mind-blowing. So, and then he also linked to the fact that in the byte string case and the text case both were implementations on Hackage right now where people had basically done this independently, but the same technique had been applied. So something's quite exciting is happening there, and it's not a case of, oh, we have to have a big fight about who's right or wrong. But we've got a place where we've got a number of different inputs attacking the overall experience of what it means to then build on Haskell in usage, which is a little bit away from the research community and a little bit away from the core standardization. But I would like to find a way to incorporate those explorations into our work as we advance the language.
Mm-hmm. Have any comments?
Isn't that the core language committee purview? That's not our, like, that Haskell Prime is not about the prelude or the base libraries.
I should point out there is a separate standardization effort, which is the library committee, which is kind of trying to standardize the rest of the ecosystem. Of course, the actual language is kind of a small part of what you do when you program, right? Libraries are another big issue. And they're getting pretty good, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Okay, so overloading is another kind of thing that comes up a lot. So say things like multi-parameter type classes, we've had those for, well, many, many years now, but they're somehow non-standard yet, so maybe we should standardize them. Yes, okay. And then there's flexible instances and context. This is perhaps, this is the names the GHC uses, but they kind of allow for, they relax some of the restrictions or how you define instances, that there are trade-offs there. So anyway, I don't know if people use those extensions. I end up using them quite often, which is why I brought it up. And usually if you use the one, you use the other one too. So certainly they seem to go together.
What are the trade-offs?
Well, it gets a little bit technical, but basically, so first what they are, we should maybe say. So so if you write instance eq list of int, right? So that's not a valid standard Haskell instance because all the instances have to be a constructor followed by some variables, okay? And so when you do things like eq list of int, sometimes the type checking doesn't quite work the way you might think it will work because basically GHC is not going to, or whatever your implementation, I'm talking about how these things work in GHC. Well, you won't commit to an instance until it's sure that you have an int kind of there, right? And sometimes what you want is to kind of say, well, the only instance I have really is going to be for int. So as soon as you know it's a list, please use this instance and go on. So it's dubious if maybe we should have a different improvement mechanism for that. But yeah, anyway, so that's why when you write these instances, sometimes you get kind of surprising behavior where you think, oh, clearly this constraint should have simplified, but it doesn't simplify, kind of. And that those kinds of issues don't arise if you don't use the flexible instances. There's probably other issues too. And Wouter has a comment. Get a microphone.
Yeah, so I had a broader question maybe, which is how hung up are people on type inference? Because a lot of the difficulty in specifying some things like GADTs or multi-parameter type classes, if you really want to nail down the spec, you have to explain how to infer these types, and that's just really hard. And one thing you could imagine the language specification saying is that, well, as long as you give enough annotations, the specification says this is what is type correct, and you need to give a signature. And if the implementations guarantee that if you give the signature, that's the behavior you get, but might infer a little bit more. So that could make the job for the committee much easier and separate kind of specification from implementations further.
Yeah, that's an option. I mean, I'm not really aware of any problems with multi-parameter type classes. Certainly GADTs are much trickier because things are ambiguous without
type families. I mean, there's lots of very fancy machinery out there. But it would mean giving up kind of a dogma of Haskell 98, at least, which was that... Well, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, we do have to write them even, the signature sometimes, even in Haskell 98. Yeah, but I get your point.
So Leonard said that we've already given up on the type annotations with polymorphic recursion, and that's true, of course. But I think this is a slightly separate issue of there's still an understanding that if you put the type signature on, you get polymorphic recursion. And so what I think what we have to give up on is that there's a document that says what programs are accepted and what programs are not accepted. And so what Wouter is suggesting is to have some sort of minimum bar. What I understand is to have a minimum bar that these programs will be accepted, but maybe more with fewer type annotations, but we don't really know which. And that might be okay. But it just means I think right now the reports say these programs are accepted, these are not, and it's definitive, and we would have to back off that.
If we go that route and say that some programs are okay, if you put enough type annotations, we have to make sure we can put type annotation anywhere where we want. So we basically want, that would imply scope type variables in some form to enter the standard, which I think is a good thing because... Okay, thank you.
Okay, that wasn't, I skipped that slide, but scope type variables and kind signatures also seem like a fairly small, we have lots of thumbs up, maybe. Okay, and yeah. Could you get the microphone, please?
I actually don't know the answer to this, but if you have a for all in a module that does not have scope type variables enabled, that variable, if variables quantified in that for all don't scope over the, do they?
They don't.
So you would break, I mean, if you added this to the, and enabled it by default in the next report, then you'd break those modules, potentially, wouldn't you?
But yeah.
They should, okay, all right, fine, yeah, that's...
I mean, yeah, it is a potentially breaking change. It doesn't seem like it will be well, who knows, but it doesn't seem like a very likely thing to happen, but it might.
What you could do that would avoid breaking things if you had a different syntax, rather than just saying for all, you had something that explicitly said for all, and I'm binding this variable, rather than just using it in here.
Yeah, it's an option to use a different syntax. There's a comment there.
So the problem with sort of requiring, well, not quite requiring type annotations only to the point where the compiler doesn't figure it out, is GHC already has that problem, is that subtle aspects of type inference change over time, and the program that worked yesterday is not going to work tomorrow. So I thought it would be kind of obvious. I don't know if it was obvious to everybody, but I was a little surprised that nobody else mentioned that. So I would argue strenuously against that, that you do that kind of specification. That you back off of saying these programs are not accepted, right? So the suggestion was that you just say, well, if there's enough type annotations, then you say what the semantics of that are and that they're going to be accepted, but that you don't say these programs that lack certain type annotations will not be accepted, and that you rely on the fanciness of the type inference and your actual implementation to figure it out. Because the result is going to be, people will write their program, they will, it will not type check, so they'll slap on some random type annotations, up to the point where the compiler accepts it, and sometimes changes happen to the fanciness of that machinery that will make yesterday's program not work today. And that already happens, but right now you can just say, well, tough luck, because your program didn't follow the standard anyway, and you were relying on implementation-specific extensions. But if you go that route, you will not be able to rely on the standard, and that, I think, so in my experience, is not going to work out well.
I don't really want to. I don't want to write a program in one compiler, and as far as I know, be using the standard thing. And maybe I've accidentally used something that's not in the standard, but the compiler accepts, and then move to a different compiler, and then suddenly it failed, and I don't understand why. I want it to tell me, even if it's just a warning. I want to I want the compiler to let me know if I'm using something that's not technically allowed by the standard. Even if it's happy to actually accept it, it should still let me know, which means you still need to do that type checking.
Right, so it would really be, I think it would be a good property of the standard that if you write a program in the standard, you know if the program follows the standard or not, and any implementation that follows the standard should accept it. So there is a risk with kind of partially specifying things in that respect. So we are, of course, going to try, and the Wouter has, to specify things precisely.
And to, I guess, to frame what seems to be an underlying current, it seems like the standardization effort is both, some people are expressing a desire to make sure that we restrict compilers that stick to the standard, and others want to make sure that compilers implement all of the standard in a particular way, and that these seem to be, like, we should be framing the discussion, I think, in terms of acknowledging these two, this axis of what we care about in our specification.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I start. There are two comments. First, for the, like, what if the program slightly changes if you're, like, the meaning of your program slightly changes if you are programming in the thing that's just adjacent to the standard, but not in the standard. Maybe, for example, for the stuff with type annotations, if you have access to the old compiler that it worked in, you can ask, please fix the program to be inside the spec, so add as much annotations as you need. And then if you have the old compiler still around, then you can move it into some standard form, and then the new compiler will accept it. Like Stack makes it relatively easy to freeze everything. The other thing that I have, if you're adding, making a breaking change, like, for example, the for all that we have said, can we also then convert the pragma into a negative pragma? So instead of me changing all the code, what's broken, we could just say, I just add an annotation, like an extension that I say, I don't want this. So I don't have to actually change all the code, I just add it at the top, and then it will still work. And I just say...
Yeah, we should separate the tooling aspect. Certainly we can do whatever we want with GHC. How GHC is going to cope with the next version, well, we'll have to figure it out. But yeah, certainly we want to provide warnings and help for people to avoid these gotchas. I was going to say that for all, I don't think it's in any standard anyway at the moment, right? So you've already written a program that doesn't follow the standard, but we of course don't want to go and break people's code.
Sure, but for example, for if you make overloaded strings standard and it only works with
that's right.
And then you can just say at the top, whatever, give me the old behavior.
I don't know if Simon could comment, but I imagine that there would be a pragma like we have now, Haskell 2010, Haskell 2020, and then maybe we could have more pragmas. I'm Haskell 2020, but without this and that, and that's a, yeah.
And you just have the top of your file at the moment, you say language, and you add sort of, this or that. You could just say no overloaded strings. Do we have that already? Yeah, right, it's there already. Right, just put that at the top. There you go, done. That was quick.
Okay, Wouter, you had a point.
So I just want to reply to the question about changing standards and changing if the type inference algorithm changes, right? One thing you could do is if you fix the standard and you have a Haskell 2020 pragma, which requires type annotations on all pattern matches on GADTs, right? Because that's easier to specify. And then if you want to kind of rely on type inference that GHC can often do for GADTs, you would have a kind of a GADT type inference pragma, and then you know that you're relying on something very GHC specific, which is outside the standard. So it doesn't have to bite, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So requiring slightly more signatures than are perhaps strictly necessary is one way to,
comment on kind signatures. I love kind signatures. I want them in the language. However, if possible, I would try to avoid putting the star syntax in the language.
Yeah, what to call star. That is a whole other big thing. Yeah. Phil?
So regarding the type inference stuff, there's lots of real interesting research to do there. But that doesn't seem to be what's in the scope for Haskell Prime. If Haskell Prime is about consolidating, bringing things together, then it probably shouldn't be about doing very controversial things like saying, well, we're not going to specify the inference and it might work here and not work there. I mean, there's real interesting research to do there. I'm not saying it's a bad idea at all, but I would think that would be outside the scope of what I understand Haskell Prime as being about, which is consolidation. And what I do suggest is that you pick a tiny number of things where you think consolidating this will really help. And then that should be your focus. So it might be, we're going to get records right for what we started with. Or, at least a lot better for a lot of people, right? Rather than the mishmash we have now. Or we're going to get the standard prelude right in the sense that we want to minimize allocation. That will really help a lot of people if you push on that. So that might be the thing to focus on. Or we want to get GADTs in there and standardize. But pick some fairly substantial chunk and just focus on that. And right now I ask, well, what is Haskell Prime about? I'm not really getting an answer. Right? I think there should be an answer you can give, a thing that you're trying to do that's fairly specific.
Yeah,
and that might take a while to evolve. But I suggest you really have a compact mission statement for Haskell Prime. And maybe there could be several Haskell Primes with different compact mission statements, and then you guys get together or something. But there has to be a thing, not just a mishmash of stuff. And focus on consolidation rather than exploration. We've already got great mechanisms for exploration. Or if you think we need another great mechanism for exploration, then do that. But keep that separate from consolidation, because we need that as well.
Thank you.
And then my last comment is, if you don't make at least one change that breaks a little bit, such as introducing scoping for alls, which might break a tiny number of programs, which, as Leonard pointed out, nobody should ever have written. If you don't introduce such a change like that, something's wrong. I'll be disappointed. Right? You have to move deliberately and break things.
Okay. All right. Okay, so it sounds like we're over our time. So let's end there. I have lots more suggestions. Please find me, chat with me and among yourselves, and please get involved. Send email to the Haskell Prime list. Involvement from the community is really appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, John.